I would like to introduce to you the young and devilishly handsome Mr. David Cronenberg. And we'll prove that as we go through our conversation tonight. And I think what number two, who is telling me a very interesting and funny story about being on the jury at the Cannes Film Festival. This was the year that Crash won the award that was spoken about in the introduction. And Adam was on the jury, and the head of the jury was Francis Ford Coppola. And Adam, when he got back from Cannes, said, "How did it go, man? Like, what goes on in those juries?" And he says, "Well, you know, it was really interesting." He says, "In the last gathering of the jury members, we all sat at this table, and Francis Coppola stood up at the head of the table and had all the films that were kind of shortlisted for the prizes, and he would hold up a card, and that would encourage the jury members to kind of discuss their last sort of points and vote. You know, so they went through their films, whatever they were at the time, Four Weddings and a Funeral, or Cocoon 3, or those. And then Crash, and people would talk and vote, and then Crash holds up the card and said, "Crash." And Adam said, before anybody had a chance to say anything, Francis Coppola took his lighter and set the card on fire. And David, I think that must make you feel fantastic.
Really, really good. And then when I became president of the jury, I actually set fire to one of the other jury members. No, that's not true. Yes, Francis really, really thought that Crash was an evil film. And I think that exposes the basic sort of Catholic, Italian, American approach to filmmaking that Francis has. He would have some empathy for a film like Crash, but really had none. We're not supposed to know this or be talking about this because everything that happens in the jury room is supposed to be a secret, so I don't know. But that's Adam. You're going to have to tell him. He squealed.
But does that surprise you? Do these kind of reactions surprise you?
No, I mean, I knew that, well, it surprised me because it was Coppola, but Crash really was based on a very controversial book by J.G. Ballard. It had been quite controversial in the early 70s when it came out, and so I assumed that the movie would be somewhat controversial, but it was 30 years later, so I thought it wouldn't be as controversial, and it really obviously struck a huge nerve, especially in America, where Ted Turner tried to suppress the film. Ted and his then-wife Jane Fonda seemed to be very worried about teenagers having sex in cars. I think that was what they said. I wanted to tell him that half of America had been conceived in the backseat of the Ford Fairlanes, but it just seemed not to. Ted Turner, his company, had bought New Line Cinemas, which was releasing Crash. So I was about to get on a plane to do publicity for Crash, and then I got a phone call from a guy there who said, "Don't get on the plane." You know, it's one of those, "Don't get on the plane." "Why not?" "Well, we're going to delay the release of Crash for, could be forever." So he wouldn't tell me that it was Ted, but I found out ultimately that Ted Turner had tried to suppress the film. He was very upset by it. This is a man who's renowned for actually crashing his yacht into his wife's competing yacht when they were racing together, and she was pregnant at the time. I swear this is true. He apparently crashed, she was beating him, and he couldn't deal with it, so he crashed his yacht into hers and sank her boat. So I guess that was the nerve that was pressed.
Well, you know, I saw Crash when it came out, and honestly, I wasn't quite sure what to make of it. And I'm going through your films again this week. I was watching your films, and I watched Crash, and I thought it was one of the most beautiful films I've ever seen. It was, I don't know, I was surprised again. I don't know if sometimes when a film comes out, you expect it to be something that you're bringing to it because of the publicity or whatever, but you know, I think often it's getting over your initial kind of thinking of what it is. But seeing it again, I thought, wow, this is like a Bertolucci, kind of fucked up love story, but it's like, I was really amazed at, the love story in it.
Well, speaking of Bertolucci, he told me that he thought it was a religious masterpiece. So I accept that, because I accept the masterpiece part, and the religious part we have to discuss. But no, well, I think, see, I thought it was a beautiful film myself. It's just that it's a different kind of beauty, and I must say that in a lot of my filmmaking, I realize, without consciously doing it, that I am trying to alter my own aesthetic sense, my own sense of what is beautiful, what is not beautiful, by seeing through the superficial surface, or not superficial, it's a surface that's a redundancy anyway, to see through the structures of society and aesthetics and culture and history to some kind of other kind of reality, other kind of truth. And I find a lot of that in science, in biology, in those insects, those praying mantises eating crickets, actually, not grasshoppers, because there's a beauty in that too.
Yeah.
And I don't, when I was a kid, I was actually a very sweet little kid, I assure you. But there were those praying mantises. There were a lot of them in Toronto in those days. It was before DDT came along. And I did see that as beautiful. And I saw those creatures as beautiful. So I eventually realized that a lot of other people didn't see that. So even in, for example, Dead Ringers, when I have one of the Jeremy Irons saying, why not have beauty contests for the insides of bodies? Inner beauty, the most perfect spleen, the most perfectly formed liver. We seem to only have an aesthetic for the outside of our bodies and not for the inside, which is quite strange. The insides of our own bodies is repulsive and disgusting to us. This is quite odd. I find this quite unacceptable, frankly. In my films, I sometimes deliberately try to do something about that, to create something that at first is slightly repulsive or horrible, and hopefully by the end of the movie, your aesthetic sense, you the viewer, has shifted somewhat, and you begin to see the beauty in what it is.
Well, a lot of your other films are,
for example, Crash is being very cold, but there's a difference between sentiment and emotion.
Yeah.
And I think sentimentality is, well, I think it was Oscar Wilde who said that sentiment is the death of true emotion. It's a sort of conditioned response, and Hollywood plays on that a lot. Most Hollywood movies are just push-button sentiment movies. There's no real emotion, there's no real complexity in them. So I try very hard, maybe to a fault, to avoid that, to avoid sentiment, to avoid the easy emotion, in order to get to something that feels to me more real. But by necessity, then it's much more complex, because I think the way we work emotionally and how that connects with our cerebration, our intellect, is quite a complex thing, and they're never separate, ever. So I'm getting to that, and if you don't respond to that, then I can accept that some of the films feel perhaps cold, but I don't think of them as cold at all.
No, I mean,
Here we go.